Hi everybody, welcome to our final lecture. This is the narrative therapy lecture and hopefully you will find it interesting. So, our previous lecture was on solution-focused brief therapy, and we learned about how that therapy is focused on the here and now. It is goal-oriented and uses techniques such as the miracle question and looking for exceptions and looking at goal setting, and overall it's aimed at people who are prepared to work on themselves and work with the counsellor. Today's learning outcomes are we're going to demonstrate knowledge on the process of solution-focused brief therapy and narrative therapy. Unfortunately, that would have been so if the lectures had run like before, but we're just looking at narrative therapy right now. We're going to identify the fundamental principles and concepts of narrative therapy and discuss the social and historical origins of narrative therapy because we've already done solution-focused brief therapy. So narrative therapy is basically it works on the premise that we are always interpreting our world. We interpret our world and create narratives around our memories and our experiences, and narrative therapy works on the premise that that's what we need to get to in order to sort of reflect back some change in our world. So when we look at a person's narrative or what they're doing or saying about their own lives or their own experiences or a particular experience, then we can start to understand why that experience or why their life is causing them harm or causing them hurt, for example, or why they're stuck or why they can't kind of push through. So quite often it's a story that the client tells himself. So it's existentialist. The world has no inherent meaning except the one we give to it. So we know that existentialists believe that actually the only way that humans interpret their world is through their own lived experience. And we know that this is reflected in stories, for example, narratives. Identity is formed by the narrative of a client's life. We just discussed that. And the narrative, and by extension, the interpretation of the narrative influences thinking, feeling, and behaviour. And so you can imagine that a person with whom you work with using narrative therapy, you may also use other techniques and tools in addition to. But it's just getting them to realise that this narrative is really the information that's going in on a daily basis, and that's what they're sort of working with. So the idea is to change it. Many narratives are healthy and useful. We do have many narratives about ourselves and our lives that are healthy and useful, and generally that's a strength, and so you would use those narratives with your client as a strength. However, some are not. They are negative and they focus on difficulties. And so if we, as narrative therapists, perhaps believe that a person creates meaning from their narratives, then if a person's narrative is sort of going round and round and round in their head or round and round and round in their life, and it's negative, then you're going to find that that person will be responding to that. And much like, the discussions that we've had around CBT or REBT, where we know it's the cognitions, or we assume it's the cognitions that are, sort of predicting or informing behaviour, then we can look at narrative therapy in a similar way and say that it's the story that's informing these difficulties or non-adaptive or maladaptive behaviour. So individuals who come to seek therapy have narratives that are problem-focused where the dominant theme is problems rather than solutions. So, if you're thinking about having a look at the case studies and thinking, which, or could I use narrative therapy with these, is there a case study which sort of highlights that idea that this person, the client, is telling themselves, narratives that are problem focused rather than solution focused. So who are the contributors? Here's a bit of sort of historical stuff here. Michael White and David Epstein were the major contributors, and you can have a look at that reference there on positive psychology in regards to narrative therapy. I won't click through to it now. The main problem is the problem, or the problem is the problem. The person is not the problem. Michael White and David Epstein. And that reminds us too about REBT, where that's an older therapy and uses some different sort of language, but it's the sin, not the sinner. It's the problem, not the person who is the problem. They believe that reality is socially constructed, which means that our interactions and dialogue with others impacts the way we experience reality. So it's, a constructivist point of view. It's how we live is based on how we interact, how we perceive things. Reality is influenced by and communicated through language, which suggests that people who speak different languages may have radically different interpretations of the same experiences. And so much research has been done around language and how language impacts the way certain cultures feel about things. In certain cultures, there are many, many, many ways to describe the colour white. Eskimo cultures, for example, and yet we pretty much have, half a dozen words, because white for us it doesn't describe a lot for us. Yet there are other cultures in which white might, like if it's the colour of ice, might be the centre of conversations about, their lifestyle, where they can go, where they can't go, etc. So what I'm trying to say here is that language and the way we use language is very culturally connected, and so narrative therapy would have to take that into account. Having a narrative that can be understood helps us organise and maintain our reality. In other words, stories and narratives help us to make sense of our experiences, and you'll find that certain cultures like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures really value narratives. That's how they impart their stories, that's how they impart their wisdom, that's how they communicate, is through storytelling. And so for some cultures, this narrative, or the idea of narrative, is very, very strong. Some cultures don't value narrative. They don't value the story behind it. They value perhaps more, high, or they kind of value more low context. They sort of will give instructions, and that's pretty much all there is to it, right? Whereas others, in order to explain something to you, they'll frame it up in a story. Is your culture like that? There is no objective reality or absolute truth. What is true for us may not be the same for another person, or even for ourselves at another point in time, and that's very existentialist. You can grow up in the same family as your sibling, and yet they've had a completely different experience, because our own perceptions inform our lives. There is no actual, reality. It's the reality that I experienced, which is, the reality for me. So narrative therapy in action, what are some causes of symptoms? So according to narrative therapy, it might relate to unhealthy or negative narratives. So the client might come in and they have, a very low self-confidence, for example. And as you get into their story, you realise that they keep telling themselves the same, clip of information that is related to you're not enough, you're not good enough. And therefore, they lack confidence. There may also be a misunderstanding of the narrative, whether it is positive or negative. If the narrative is misunderstood, there can be symptoms. So where a client comes in and represents a story in a way that shows a clear misunderstanding of what actually happened, then all along they have been sort of, you know, living a lie, if you like, or living under a false sort of pretext, because that didn't actually happen. A classic one was with a client who said to me, my dad never wanted me because I was a daughter, not a son. And I said, how do you know that? Because I remember my dad saying, when you were born, we wanted a boy, but then it was a girl and we fell in love with you anyway. So her voice in her head says, oh, we wanted a boy. She's sort of focused on this idea. But actually they adored her, because yes, they did want a boy, but once she was born, the daughter became the wanted child. But she didn't hear that. There was a misunderstanding of what had actually happened. And this affected her whole life. So, that was really difficult. Misrepresentation as above, but there is a misrepresentation of the issue, and it has led to symptoms. So a variant of what I just talked about. And all of these situations can interfere with an individual's ability to change. So what are some of the techniques that narrative therapy uses? Well, there is no diagnosing. There are exceptions, but diagnosis is avoided. It's not a part of, a psychological diagnosis. There really is just a focus, or sorry, for that matter, any kind of diagnosis. There really is just a focus on the story and trying to come to terms with what the story means and looking for an alternative way of viewing that period of time in which the story was created. So no diagnosis. We seek to understand the narrative, so to create an environment where the client can tell the story and they generally want to tell the story. And therapists are going to look for themes and understand the narrative and see it in a different way. So I also had another client who had been quite bullied at school, and she was also a musically gifted student, but she remembered that predominantly her life was, she had been bullied, and she was very anxious, and she had social phobia and things like that. So we looked at this narrative and agreed that yes, that had happened, but we also looked at the story of her time throughout school and noticed that she'd also joined the band, made a very close friend, and was really successful in other things. So, we created a narrative around school that didn't just focus on the bullying, but also, on this alternative stuff that also happened. That's one of the techniques. And we named the problem as part of a technique. By this, it means that you give it a mutually agreed upon name. So it's like naming a story. The story of me being bullied, or the story of me not believing in myself. It's given a name so that you can externalize it. You can say, well, I'm not that bully person. It's just a story about myself that happened, right? And so you create some distance between the name of the narrative and the person. And here we externalize the problem. With the name, you can externalize the problem. That is, the anxiety or depression is not framed as internal. In other words, I am depressed, or in my example, I am a bullied person, or I'm not a good person. In narrative therapy, the counsellor gives the problem its own identity and separates it from the person. This helps to reduce the blame, so the connection, is loosened. Sometimes people can feel that they are the cause of what's happened to them, and so by separating it, we can look at the problem, we can review it and analyze it separate to the client, which feels nicer, and it makes it, as the second point says, they're easier to deal with. What effects has the problem had? This reduces guilt as well. For example, if the problem caused a lot of extraneous issues. So, when we're working with stories or narratives, it just gives the client a sense that, look, I can now begin to let go of the way that this makes me feel. Because the problems that you have in life, or the stories that you tell, they make you feel a certain way. And when you're dealing with them as something a little bit externalized, it's just easier. We also use questions and curiosity. So these influence, and what influence has the problem had on the client. Oh, sorry. We look for influence. What influence has the problem had on the client or on the problem itself? So you're just looking to find out, about the problem. What happened? How has it influenced you? What are the effects? And then you look at the future, exploring the past in a way when they ask the client to tell the story, but also we ask about the future. So we certainly get a roundup of what happened, but we don't dwell on that. We look at we look forward. So the techniques involve finding alternative stories, positive stories, and unique outcomes. And so by the alternative stories, it's just that one that I mentioned before when I talked about my client who had been experienced bullying at school. She also experienced great success by being in the band because she was very musical. So that's an alternative story that happened at the same time. The counsellor collects information about potential alternative stories when they are listening to the client tell the story. And this is when the client is asked to construct an alternative story that explains the event. Maybe also, sometimes an event is not explainable, it just has to be accepted, and we can focus on an alternative story that happened simultaneously. For example, with people who have been abused, that did happen, but also there were other things that were positive perhaps that were happening at the same time. So it just gives that person a sense of relief and release from just being the person who was abused to also being a lot more things and many other good things. But sometimes people just focus on the story and it becomes their life. Positive stories, similarly under this technique, negative stories lead to symptoms and positive lead to preferred outcomes. So we look for positive alternatives. Unique outcomes. This is important. Therapists look for exceptions to the dominant theme, which is normally negative. So looking for exceptions is sparking moments, and sparkling moments, these are inconsistent with the dominant negative theme. So what we're looking for is, yes, you have this story. Yes, it's affected you. But what about when this happened? And that was an exception. And so we look for those. We're looking for those all the time to show the client or for the client to be able to reflect, hey, I'm more than just this one story. And that's how the techniques work together. They also use letters, writing letters or posts online. It's a form of written communication, takes place after the session and is made available to the client. It includes the positive story or alternative story. It includes unique outcomes and other reassuring comments from the counsellor to the client. And the client can read this and read these letters and, continues to work on reconstructing their new narrative, because now I've got this new information, the client says to themselves, I can start to memorize this. I can start to let this integrate into who I am. And we were very successful with that client who had been bullied. We wrote a whole new narrative, and actually she wrote it. She wrote her story herself and brought it into me, and we read it, and it was really life-affirming for her to talk about not only what had happened to her, and we acknowledged that, so we absolutely accepted it happened, but also this other great stuff that had happened that she hadn't allowed herself to remember. So that's how powerful this technique is. We can also use inclusion of family members, and narrative therapy can be used in individual or a family context because there can be letters and other documents sent to families that can be used. So narrative therapy, what's your story? According, if you have a look at this little infographic here, it's just really a summary of the principles of narrative therapy and the narrative therapy techniques. I just thought it was a good infographic, although very light. It comes through very light there. You might have to make it bigger if you look at it. So I've got a video here, and I'm going to pop it on. So we want to watch this role play about with narrative therapy in action. Excuse my internet, which is severely slow. So I think we might get an ad first. So narrative therapy role play where we externalize the problem of excessive worry.
Good grammar and spelling.
No, we don't want Grammarly. So I might pause it now and again just to chat about it. So of course this is a role play.
Hey, April, how you doing today?
I'm okay.
And
Okay.
he doesn't say
A
bro.
little bit anxious lately.
Right.
I've got a lot of pressure coming up at work. And as we talked about before, work is kind of a struggle for me because of all the pressure I'm under.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So you're feeling a bit anxious, and it's work-related.
yeah.
So what's going on there?
Well, I'm a member of HR, and I'm we have hiring fairs and other things where we need to hire people, and there's only like 2 or 3 of us who do the job, and next week we have an event where we need to hire some people, and I'm just really worried about hiring the right people and making these tough decisions about like the future of our company.
All right. So you're worried that you'll select people that aren't ideal for the positions?
Right, like that's happened before where someone's done that and hired some wrong people, and like some things happened in the company and then that person got in trouble for it. So I just want to make sure I hire like people who are going to be good for our company, and there's a lot that rests on like my judgment.
And the worrying gets in the way of the judgment.
Yeah, because I kind of second guess my instincts
Mhm.
on people and if they will be good.
How long has the worrying been part of your life?
For as long as I can remember. I'm just like a worrier. Like I worry about everything.
Worry about everything. So
Yeah.
not just interviewing people, but other areas as well.
Yeah, definitely.
But this interviewing people, this worry is more intense right now. This is what you're thinking about now.
Right. Like I don't want to be fired for, hiring the wrong people, or I don't want my company to not do well because they hired the wrong people. Like it's a lot of pressure for me, I feel like. So I'm really nervous.
All right. So it sounds like you're really struggling with this. You're worried about the company you work for and your own job,
Yeah.
and your performance. And you mentioned that you're a worrier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I worry about everything.
It's kind of how you view yourself.
Definitely.
So what if we reframe this another way and think about the worry as a separate entity? Right, so you're kind of identifying as a worrier now.
Mhm.
Like it's part of you.
Right. Like it's who I am.
Like it's who you are. But in actuality, the worry is external to a degree, right? So let's have you here. Let's move the worry over here a bit. And think of the worry as almost a separate entity.
Okay.
Right? So what's the worry trying to do to you? What's the separate entity of worry trying to do?
The worry seems like it's trying to make me doubt myself and question my own judgment and not have faith that I'll make the right choice.
All right, so it's generally disrupting you from your...
Yeah, I don't have as much confidence.
All right, so the worry is over here. So worry is over here, and it's making these attempts to lower your confidence, make you question how good you are at your job.
Right.
In a way, it's trying to manipulate you into believing those things.
Right.
What does evidence suggest in terms of your history in this particular function, as your function of interviewing people? How have you performed?
I think I've done okay so far.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've been doing this particular job for a while now, and I'm one of the people they rely on to do it the most, like to hire the most people. So, I would say I'm doing a pretty good job right now, but it's kind of like, seeing what happened to somebody else, I'm kind of like worried about that.
All right, so the evidence tells you that, if you evaluate the evidence, it tells you that you're doing okay in that job, but you see other people that haven't done as well.
Right.
And that's when that worry comes back and tries to convince you that you're not going to do well. So what do you say to the worry the next time it comes in? Like, what can you communicate to the worry?
I guess I could say that so far I've hired some people who have been worthwhile to the company, and they trust me to do this job. My bosses trust me to do this job, so chances are I'll make an informed decision based on my experience.
All right, so that's the challenge that you can put up against worry when it comes to try to influence you. All right. Is that something you feel you can do the next time you have thoughts of worry?
It's hard sometimes.
Yeah.
Because I feel like the worry voice is really loud sometimes.
It's a strong voice.
Yeah.
Try to think of it when that voice is audible. Try to think of it as something external, right? Not necessarily something internal, like you're a worrier, like that thought, but more like worries outside of me and worries trying to come in.
Like trying to influence or manipulate me.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, try to reframe it in that way, rather than identifying as a worrier. I know that's real for you, and that's how you identify. But let's try this experiment where we treat the worry as kind of an outsider that's encroaching in on your territory and disrupting your job a bit, and then your job then would be to challenge.
So here he's giving her a new narrative, a new story to tell herself. Try to think of the worry as being something external that's trying to challenge you. Okay, so far her narrative has been, I am worried. I worry all the time. I'm a worrier, right? I'm the problem. Well, what he's now done is externalized worry and said it's over there, and said instead of telling you yourself that story, tell yourself the story that it's trying to challenge you.
Challenge the thoughts that worry tries to introduce.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So when's the next time you'll be interviewing people for your job?
Next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday. So you feel like next Wednesday you can apply that kind of reframe?
I think so.
All right. Give that a try.
Okay. So what we can see then is that by using alternative ways of approaching, our lives, in other words, telling ourselves something else about our life, in other words, the story, the new narrative, we can expect new and better outcomes. So what did you observe there? What were the key themes around narrative therapy, and how is this therapy similar to solution-focused brief therapy or any other therapy? So maybe you can talk about that with your lecturer. And so the goals of narrative therapy are to deconstruct problem-saturated narratives. As you heard there, she had this problem. I worry all the time. I'm so worried about what's going to happen. And the counsellor then worked with her to take apart the story and understand the different components. of it, so that we can understand how it's actually just a story that she tells herself. And he didn't say that to her, oh, I just want you to realize that you are just telling yourself this story. He didn't say that. He said, why don't you try separating the worry out of yourself? And now what does that feel like? Why do you think the worry is trying to do this to you? But really all along, he's working with narratives. He's working with ideas that she has around what worry is to her. And then we want to, and he did do this, rewrite the narrative. So the counsellor reconstructs the narrative by working with the client. So the reconstruction of that particular example was, you're not a worrier, you're a good decision maker. Worry sometimes comes along and tries to interfere. Tell it you're okay. You realize it's just trying to manipulate you. And we try to accurately understand the new narrative, since misunderstanding it will lead to more symptoms. Obviously, a good, thorough discussion of what the new narrative is. Writing it down, for example, working with it ensures that there's an accurate understanding. And then we ensure the new narrative facilitates change. It facilitates change. And we reconstruct the identity of the problem, and they reconstruct to move through the particular problem and provide a new interpretation of the narrative. So if you could actually see those 5 steps sort of being played out in that little role play. So what are the pros and cons of narrative therapy? Look, the pro is that there's a real commitment on the part of the counsellor to help the client understand their story. Other theories of counselling allow the story to be heard, but not at the level and depth that narrative therapy allows it. And so the telling is important, and allowing this process is crucial. A lot of other therapies don't really go into that depth, and we know that because we know that a lot of therapies are about the here and now. And so this, the idea of going back doesn't appear fruitful. It doesn't appear to go with, the type of therapy that it is. So, say for example, Gestalt, not necessary. So this is lovely because it allows the story to be told. And sometimes you just need to hear a client's story for them to realise things about, the things that they've been believing for a long time. I had a client actually who would tell me about how, she was an older client, she would tell me about how back in the olden days her mother-in-law would put her down and make her feel bad, and this is part of why she couldn't get along with her mother-in-law at the moment. And she told me the story of how her husband's brother had a wife who the mother-in-law was always going to and helping. So here's a new, set of glasses. Here, I've made this food for you. Here, I've bought this for you. And she was saying to me, my client is saying to me, and she would put me down by not coming to me and not helping me. She didn't care about me as much as she did my sister-in-law, my brother's wife. And so we looked at that story, and I heard it really deeply, and so did she. And we decided there might have been a different story going on at the same time. And that was that the mother-in-law didn't think very much of her sister-in-law, and so had to support her so that the son could get as much benefit as he, could. Whereas my client was a very competent wife. I mean, she was quite old, so we're talking about the 50s here. She was a great cook, and she was a great seamstress, and she was a great homemaker. And so the mother-in-law didn't need to support her a lot. Whereas, that narrative was never obvious. And once it became obvious, it changed all of her symptoms. It changed the way she thought about herself and also her mother-in-law. So understanding the narrative is a fantastic thing in narrative therapy. There's also a focus on the effect of the problem. So, other theories focus on the cause, and that's not useful sometimes to the client. It's actually more useful sometimes to focus on the effect and work towards a solution. So what is it doing to you? It's making you feel this way, right? Let's focus on how it's making you feel and kind of move towards solving that through coming up with a different narrative. However, the cons are that it can actually be useful to focus on the problem, because sometimes the cause is under the client's control. And so when you don't focus so much on the problem, but you're focusing on the outcome, you may not, or you may miss an opportunity to say, well, hang on, you're part of that cause. You're part of that problem. What is it that you can do about that? But because it's not that type of therapy, it just focuses on outcomes and it focuses on sort of moving forward, you might miss a chance. The pros and cons of externalizing the problem, sorry. The pro can be, it's useful when clients are experiencing a lot of guilt or shame. This technique is effective at reducing those feelings by making it separate from the client. But the cons are that it de-emphasizes accepting accountability, whereas sometimes it is important for the client to accept responsibility. So there can be, pros and cons. And you would externalize a problem that really does appear to be outside of the control, or a problem that does, really appear to be one that the client is holding on to and can't solve. So by externalizing, we can work on it that bit better. Family support, the idea of family support is part of the therapy, and sometimes the problems and symptoms clients face can be attributed to unproductive family dynamics, and we know about family systems and family support through one of our last lectures. And in this case, family support is important, obviously. However, even when family is not directly involved, having their support helps the progress, in sessions. So it's quite family oriented, because, as we know, a lot of our stories come from family stories or things that were told to us which were not quite true and that have affected us all of our lives. And so involving the family becomes really positive. But the con is that sometimes, it's not even possible, and it might not be a good idea because of the challenges or that can come when a person, is confronted with, something that they said or a story that they put into the client's, head or environment, and that can be difficult. So, good idea to think of examples of this with your lecturer. So in summary, narrative therapy is respectful, it's non-blaming, and it views the client as the expert. The client has the story. The client has all the answers. All the counsellor is doing is trying to look for exceptions, look for other possibilities, other ideas that the client may not have thought of.